You are the leaders of Alpine Lumber. One of the goals in safety is to change the culture to a more positive, proactive culture. Changing culture is a process of continuous improvement. Every time you have a new employee in a new hire orientation, have a safety meeting or a one-on-one meeting, it's a chance to build the culture that you want.
Hi there, I am Kevin Pask and I am Vice President of Alpine Lumber. My advice to any new assistant manager is that they have got to lead by example and they have to be sincere on how they promote safety to all of our employees. Sincerity will go a long way in how they lead by example. That safety is our number one priority.
I think the most important thing for an assistant manager is to lead by example.
Something I think that's important for an assistant manager or any manager in our company, I guess, is lead by example for safety, not only in words but in action.
We can't ever underestimate the value of consistent leadership.
The most important thing is going to be consistency.
Is success measured through statistics? Have you ever heard of leading indicators or lagging indicators? How do each of these measure success? Leading indicators are the things you do to prevent injuries and illnesses. Lagging indicators are things that happen after the incident. We have no control over lagging indicators. They're statistics that tell us what happened. Most studies show that leading indicators are better predictors of future success than lagging indicators. But the lagging indicators are important to tell you where you've been. There's no one right answer on how success is measured. But we do have control over leading indicators. We expect leading indicators to prevent incidents and to make us more efficient. If we only manage using lagging indicators, we're basically trying to manage through the rearview mirror. Culture is the set of norms by which we live our lives every day. Let's look at it in terms of an iceberg. The visible culture makes up a small percentage of how we live our lives. It's above the waterline. It's the policies, procedures, and written rules. It's right there in black and white. But most of our culture is unwritten. It's the invisible rules that are below the waterline that are so important. The invisible rules can sink great ships if the ships aren't looking. Cultural norms are a powerful law of nature. The unwritten rules are the way we actually behave. There's no law against talking on a cell phone in a movie theater, but the unwritten rule, the cultural norm, is that you'll annoy everyone around you if you're doing this. So acceptable behavior is that you don't talk on your cell phone while in a movie theater. The invisible culture are the norms, assumptions, beliefs, and all of the acceptable behaviors. The unwritten rules or cultural norms can easily override the written rules. What's the speed limit? Are you a criminal if you're doing 70 in a 65-mile-an-hour zone? No, because our invisible culture, or the norms by which we live our lives, says it's acceptable to go a little bit over the speed limit. Do you have seasoned forklift operators still not wearing their seatbelts? Your new forklift operators will see this, and it won't matter that there's a policy in place. The new guy will look at the seasoned operator for the way we actually do business. Your job is to change the minds of your employees. Correct them when necessary so that what you want to happen is visible. Do your employees trust you? That's a big part of the cultural norms. It's a big part of that invisible culture. Each of you must figure out what the cultural norms are at your location in order to change the culture.
All right, so my expectations for a assistant manager's role here at Alpine Lumber, first of all, is to be concerned and understand safety and the culture that we have at Alpine. We obviously want to send everybody home in the same condition that they came to work in, to earn the respect of all the co-workers, so that when they're having communication about the importance of safety, and the reason that we talk about it is that people will actually respect their opinions and their thoughts on that.
I just think that
when our number twos and number threes, our assistant managers and operations managers, are in the yard and around our facilities, that they need to keep safety top of mind. They need to keep their eyes and ears open all the time, and they need to address immediately the things that they see, whether that's commenting on someone's positive behavior or correcting something that needs to be changed. But we have to focus on it all the time and just not let things slide.
So what I think would be important for an assistant manager for Alpine Lumber would be able to, for that person to be able to handle any situation that comes up. So anything you're dealing with customers or situations around the yard, that person can handle it or figure out how to handle it or find the correct person, whether that's at Corp or another location, to figure out how to handle that given situation. So they need to be flexible and be able to solve the problems themselves.
I'd say that their number one role in safety is watching another set of eyeballs. It's a big facility. The more people watching our folks behave safely or unsafely, that's what we need.
We have a culture now. Alpine Lumber has a culture. Is it the culture that you want? It takes 7 years to change a culture. This is if you're trying. It requires continuous improvement, building trust, open communication. Try to find both the obvious problems that are a risk to our company and the small things that are deeply ingrained in our culture. Risk is a measure of both the likelihood and the consequences of the hazards of an activity. It's a subjective evaluation of the chance of loss. Everyone makes their own decision what the acceptable or tolerable level of risk is. Think about this for pre-trip inspections. A driver hasn't been stopped at a port or by a state trooper in a while or maybe ever. So is that driver more willing to let vehicle maintenance deficiency slide so he can get his load delivered? You, as part of the management team, have to make this a priority. Learn from others' mistakes and ensure that you're not allowing risky behaviors to go unchecked. It starts when we're young. The more we do a behavior, the more often we're willing to take a risk, and the more we get away with it, the more risk we're willing to take. Each level of risk becomes the new norm. Repeated exposure to unsafe acts or unsafe conditions will eventually lead to injuries and accidents. People will increase their level of risk every time they get away with a behavior. What if every day when you walk into work, you had a jar and you took a pill from that jar and then you passed it on to your coworker? Now 300 of those pills would be made of sugar. 29 of them, a laxative. One of them, cyanide. It's essentially what we're doing when we ignore near misses or we don't correct unsafe behaviors. Every time you walk past a near miss, you've just passed the jar to a coworker, given them the opportunity to draw out that cyanide pill. Maybe they get lucky and they don't get injured. If they haven't corrected the issue, the jar gets passed to the next unsuspecting coworker. If you don't correct near misses and unsafe behaviors, you're putting a coworker in a position to repeat a mistake that could cause injury or death. Let's just stop passing the jar. Use your near misses to make corrections and stop bad behaviors before someone gets that cyanide pill.
I think for assistant managers, it's extremely important for them during the onboarding process with new employees to really make it clear how seriously our company takes our safety program.
I think the most important thing a new assistant manager to do is to get all of the new hires on board as quickly as possible on the whole safety culture.
I'm sure you're all aware of the HR checklist for new hires. It's long enough that there's no employee that can remember everything they've been told in one day. The best onboarding takes place over several weeks or even months. I would ask that you think about what safety issues you see most often at your yard, and over the first week or maybe 2 weeks of having a new hire, you talk to them about lessons learned that you've seen at your yard. There are some training videos available on the F Drive. I'm always trying to make them more specific to Alpine Lumber's needs. If you have something specific that you want, let me know and we'll work to find something that fits for you.
I think it's important for assistant managers to know the emergency response checklist in the event that the manager is not available during a catastrophic injury or some type of natural disaster, and what roles to follow in that response, like CPR, who's your certified CPR people, who calls the police, who calls the fire department, who works through the evacuation of the building, and most importantly, who notifies corporate of any problems that we might have.
If you're not sure what an answer to a question is, don't be afraid to ask somebody else. Always communicate.
There are 3 causes to every incident. Look for all 3 causes. Don't stop when you find the direct cause. The direct cause is the actual bad thing that happened. For example, using a box cutter, the employee cuts his hand through a glove. Indirect cause is what happened to cause the cut. For example, he was cutting toward himself. The root cause is a system failure. What allowed, encouraged, failed to identify, or failed to predict the condition. In this example, was it a lack of training, or do boxes actually need to be cut apart, or can they just be smashed? So is the box cutter the correct tool? The goal is to solve number 3, the root cause. You want to take action, which is called the root action, so the problem won't ever happen again. You haven't found the root cause until action can be taken. The solution in the box cutter might be to offer better training and to stop cutting boxes with box cutters. With any incident investigation, there are 4 important points to remember. Remember that gathering facts includes taking photos, securing the scene, and getting witness statements. The accident has happened. It doesn't help to judge or blame at this point. You may have to hold someone accountable for their actions, but try to take the blame out of it and stick to facts. Stick to policies, procedures. Notifications to management and safety need to happen as soon as possible, not the next day. So now we're going to take a look at an incident, and I'd like you to think about the causes of this incident. So we'll get back to that incident, but first, let's talk more about root causes. Remember, root causes are not the direct cause of the accident, but more likely to be management and training issues. So examples are that the policies are not in writing, there's no training to the policies are not reviewed, health and safety is not considered in the procurement of supplies and equipment. Are personnel practices adequate, such as employee selection, employee training, communication, accountability? What about environmental factors? The facility layout, access, noise, illumination, material handling issues? Maybe there was a failure to pre-plan or a failure to account for weather or access roads or surroundings. Personal factors include hiring risk takers or repeat offenders, maybe insufficient training or inadequate skills, lack of motivation, poor attitude. Many of these factors should be noted upon hiring. Is the employee fit for duty?
Thanks. Before this becomes a different kind of talk, I'm going to say that. All right, I want to see a show of hands. How many of you have ever unfriended someone on Facebook because they said something offensive about politics or religion, childcare, food? And how many of you know at least one person that you avoid because you just don't want to talk to them? You know, it used to be that in order to have a polite conversation, we just had to follow the advice of Henry Higgins and My Fair Lady, stick to the weather and your health. But these days, with climate change and anti-vaxxing, those subjects are not safe either. So this world that we live in, this world in which every conversation has the potential to devolve into an argument where our politicians can't speak to one another and where even the most trivial of issues have someone fighting both passionately for it and against it, it's not normal. Pew Research did a study of 10,000 American adults, and they found that at this moment we are more polarized, we are more divided than we ever have been in history. We're less likely to compromise, which means we're not listening to each other, and we make decisions about where to live, who to marry, and even who our friends are going to be based on what we already believe. Again, that means we're not listening to each other. A conversation requires a balance between talking and listening, and somewhere along the way we lost that balance. Now, part of that is due to technology, the smartphones that you all either have in your hands or close enough that you could grab them really quickly. According to Pew Research, about a third of American teenagers send more than 100 texts a day. And many of them, almost most of them, are more likely to text their friends than they are to talk to them face to face. There's this great piece in The Atlantic. It was written by a high school teacher named Paul Barnwell. And he gave his kids a communication project. He wanted to teach them how to speak on a specific subject without using notes. And he said this: I came to realize that conversational competence might be the single most overlooked skill we fail to teach. Kids spend hours each day engaging with ideas and each other through screens, but rarely do they have an opportunity to hone their interpersonal communication skills. It might sound like a funny question, but we have to ask ourselves, is there any 21st century skill more important than being able to sustain coherent, confident conversation? Now, I make my living talking to people. Nobel Prize winners, truck drivers, billionaires, kindergarten teachers, heads of state, plumbers. I talk to people that I like. I talk to people that I don't like. I talk to some people that I disagree with deeply on a personal level, but I still have a great conversation with them. So I'd like to spend the next 10 minutes or so teaching you how to talk and how to listen. Many of you have already heard a lot of advice on this. Things like look the person in the eye, think of interesting topics to discuss in advance, nod and smile to show that you're paying attention. Repeat back what you just heard or summarize it. So I want you to forget all of that. It is crap. There is no reason to learn how to show you're paying attention if you are, in fact, paying attention. Now, I actually use the exact same skills as a professional interviewer that I do in regular life. So I'm going to teach you how to interview people, and that's actually going to help you learn how to be better conversationalists. Learn to have a conversation without wasting your time, without getting bored, and please God, without offending anybody. We've all had really great conversations. We've had them before. We know what it's like. The kind of conversation where you walk away feeling engaged and inspired, or where you feel like you've made a real connection or you've been perfectly understood. There is no reason why most of your interactions can't be like that. So I have 10 basic rules. I'm going to walk you through all of them, but honestly, if you just choose one of them and master it, you're already going to enjoy better conversations. Number 1, don't multitask. And I don't mean just set down your cell phone or your tablet or your car keys or whatever's in your hand. I mean, be present. Be in that moment. Don't be thinking about your argument you had with your boss. Don't be thinking about what you're going to have for dinner. If you want to get out of the conversation, get out of the conversation. But don't be half in it and half out of it. Number 2, don't pontificate. If you want to just state your opinion without any opportunity for response or argument or pushback or growth, write a blog. Now, there's a really good reason why I don't allow pundits on my show, because they're really boring. If they're a conservative, they're going to hate Obama and food stamps and abortion. If they're a liberal, they're going to hate big banks and oil corporations and Dick Cheney. Totally predictable. And you don't want to be like that. You need to enter every conversation assuming that you have something to learn. The famed therapist Eb Scott Peck said that true listening requires a setting aside of oneself. And sometimes that means setting aside your personal opinion. He said that sensing this acceptance, the speaker will become less and less vulnerable and more likely to open up the inner recesses of his or her mind to the listener. Again, assume that you have something to learn. Bill Nye, everyone you will ever meet knows something that you don't. I put it this way: everybody is an expert in something. Number 3, use open-ended questions. In this case, take a cue from journalists. Start your questions with who, what, where, when, why, or how. If you put in a complicated question, you're going to get a simple answer out. If I ask you, were you terrified? You're going to respond to the most powerful word in that sentence, which is terrified, and the answer is, yes, I was, or no, I wasn't. Were you angry? Yes, I was very angry. Let them describe it. They're the ones that know. Try asking them things like, what was that like? How did that feel? Because then they might have to stop for a moment and think about it, and you're going to get a much more interesting response. Number 4, go with the flow. That means thoughts will come into your mind, and you need to let them go out of your mind. We've heard interviews often in which a guest is talking for several minutes, and then the host comes back in and asks a question which seems like it comes out of nowhere, or it's already been answered. That means the host probably stopped listening 2 minutes ago because he thought of this really clever question, and he was just bound and determined to say that. And we do the exact same thing. We're sitting there having a conversation with someone, and then we remember that time that we met Hugh Jackman in a coffee shop. And we stop listening. We're just waiting for a moment to interject our story about Hugh Jackman and coffee. Stories and ideas are going to come to you. You need to let them come and let them go. Number 5, if you don't know, say that you don't know. Now, people on the radio, especially on NPR, are much more aware that they're going on the record. And so they're more careful about what they claim to be an expert in and what they claim to know for sure. Do that. Err on the side of caution. Talk should not be cheap. Number 6, don't equate your experience with theirs. If they're talking about having lost a family member, don't start talking about the time that you lost a family member. If they're talking about the trouble that they're having at work, don't tell them about how much you hate your job. It's not the same. It is never the same. All experiences are individual. And more importantly, it is not about you. You don't need to take that moment to prove how amazing you are or how much you've suffered. Somebody asked Stephen Hawking once what his IQ was, and he says, I have no idea. People who brag about their IQs are losers. Conversations are not a promotional opportunity. Number 7, try not to repeat yourself. It's condescending and it's really boring. And we tend to do it a lot, especially in work conversations or in conversations with our kids. We have a point to make, so we just keep rephrasing it over and over. Don't do that. Number 8, stay out of the weeds. Frankly, people don't care about the years, the names, the dates, all those details that you're struggling to come up with in your mind. They don't care. What they care about is you. They care about what you're like, what you have in common. So forget the details. Leave them out. Number 9, this is not the last one, but it is the most important one. Listen. I cannot tell you how many really important people have said that listening is perhaps the number one most important skill that you could develop. Buddha said, and I'm paraphrasing, if your mouth is open, you're not learning. And Calvin Coolidge said, no man ever listened his way out of a job. Why do we not listen to each other? Number 1, we'd rather talk. When I'm talking, I'm in control. I don't have to hear anything I'm not interested in. I'm the center of attention. I can bolster my own identity. But there's another reason. We get distracted. The average person talks at about 225 words per minute, but we can listen at up to 500 words per minute. So our minds are filling in those other 275 words. And look, I know it takes effort and energy to actually pay attention to someone. But if you can't do that, you're not in a conversation. You're just two people shouting out barely related sentences in the same place. You have to listen to one another. Stephen Covey said it very beautifully. He said, most of us don't listen with the intent to understand. We listen with the intent to reply. One more rule, and number 10, and it's this one. Be brief. All of this boils down to the same basic concept, and it is this one. Be interested in other people. You know, I grew up with a very famous grandfather, and there was kind of a ritual in my home. People would come over to talk to my grandparents, and after they would leave, my mother would come over to us and she'd say, do you know who that was? She was the runner-up to Miss America. He was the mayor of Sacramento. She won a Pulitzer Prize. He's a Russian ballet dancer. And I kind of grew up assuming everyone has some hidden amazing thing about them. And honestly, I think it's what makes me a better host. I keep my mouth shut as often as I possibly can. I keep my mind open, and I'm always prepared to be amazed. And I'm never disappointed. You do the same thing. Go out, talk to people, listen to people, and most importantly, be prepared to be amazed. Thanks.
I had you watch the communication video with the idea that you'd be open to listening during an incident investigation. We tend to focus on what we think happened rather than trying to learn what really did happen. So let's watch the incident video once again and then take a moment to think about the direct, indirect, and root causes of the accident. Also try to think about what you might suggest as the root action. So the direct cause was the forklift hit a pedestrian and kept driving. The indirect cause was that the forklift operator couldn't see in front of him. So for root causes, maybe training? We don't know why he's driving with a load that's obstructing his view and why he isn't driving backward. There's a camera on the scene, so if he always drives with his vision obstructed, is this a case of positive reinforcement for bad behavior? For root action, could we train operators to drive backward if they can't see in front of themselves? Maybe have a slower speed limit where the public is walking? Remove forklifts from where the public can walk. Create a walkway where forklifts are not allowed. Make them stop and honk at the crossing and use a spotter. We have a safety alert program. Use it as a leading indicator by discussing how someone else's accident can prevent an accident at your location. It's up to you to make it work. It's not magic. You have to make it relevant. The safety alert meetings are an example of how you can create change through participation. We've had a lot of lessons learned, and we continue to make the same mistakes. You want to learn from your near misses, and you want to learn from past mistakes at other yards. It's preferred that you get forms from the intranet rather than saving them to your desktop. You'll always have the newest version this way. Accident and injury paperwork is found under the Safety tab on the intranet homepage. And there are folders. The Accident and Injury Reporting folder has the Colorado First Report of Injury. It has the Injury or Medical Treatment Report and the Vehicle Accident or Property Damage Report form. For New Mexico, I will call in the injury into Liberty Mutual, so you'll just give that information to me through email or over the phone. We also have the designated provider letters. These letters must be given to an employee within 7 days of the injury, and the employee must circle the designated provider that they chose to go to. Other forms that can be found here are the waivers and releases. So unloading or loading at your yard or at a delivery location on site. We also have the release for settlement for an auto accident on this form. Here are the most common questions I get about worker compensation. The first one is that employees are not allowed to go to their personal doctor unless you're in New Mexico, and then you are allowed to choose your own physician. Employees may not choose to stay home or go home early because of an injury. If they can't perform their normal duties, you have to send them to a doctor. If we have light duty for an injured worker, the injured worker doesn't have the option to stay home. They must come to work if we're offering them light duty. It's in our best interest to find light duty for injured workers, and I know it's a frustrating process. You find that employees sometimes tell the doctor one thing and tell you another thing, but your job is to just be supportive and follow the doctor's orders. Terminating an injured worker while they're injured is not a good idea. It's not impossible, but you'd better have a lot of documentation showing your non-injury related reasons. It cannot seem retaliatory. Let our claim manager, Marilyn Anderson from Pinnacle, and the safety manager deal with employee questions. Your job is to just be supportive. If a worker says they've been injured on the job and they can perform all of their regular duties, you can't force them to seek medical. If it's not work-related and they come to you and they say, I need light duty, you don't have to accommodate that. It's really up to you whether you accommodate a non-work-related injury for light duty. Remember that we have 4 days to submit a claim after an employee has been injured. We have 7 days to get the designated provider letter signed by the employee. Also remember waivers and releases for accidents and property damage. It's very important that you understand the difference between a regulated drug screen and a non-regulated drug screen. Regulated drug screens are regulated through the Department of Transportation, and they are specific for CDL drivers. The law is very specific when to use DOT drug screens for CDL drivers. CDL drivers only get these regulated drug screens at specific times. Pre-employment, or at the time that a non-CDL driver is being considered for a CDL position, random drug screens, reasonable suspicion, and a regulated accident that meets specific criteria. If the accident does not meet this specific criteria, the CDL driver would get a non-regulated drug screen. Regulated drug tests follow a CDL driver for the life of his file. Non-regulated drug screens are for everyone else. You would never send a non-CDL driver or an office person for a regulated drug screen. You can request that CDL drivers get non-regulated drug screens for any accidents or incidents where you feel they need drug testing. These don't go into their permanent file. However, for most situations, a CDL driver will have to have a regulated drug screen. I'll give you a minute to read over this slide. If you look at the statistics found on this slide, it's apparent that your knowledge of your workforce is going to pick out drug use on the job. If you haven't had the reasonable suspicion training, you can't use reasonable suspicion for drug testing an employee. Without training, you cannot be a witness or be a part of suspecting someone of being under the influence. The training takes about an hour, and every assistant manager should go through the training for the reasons just listed. Part of being in management is the ability to talk calmly to others even when they're not calm. You may have to be the one to confront an employee for reasonable suspicion as well as other safety violations. It's not easy, especially if you've gotten to know the employee and he's feeling defensive. So can you stay calm? Do you know the rules and what you'll say when that tough conversation is in front of you? The good news is that 10% is lower than the national average for all workers. But the reality is, if 10% are admitting to using pot, how many actually are? Learn to document safety issues and violations. While you may feel like your coworkers are your family, this is a business, and you have to be able to separate yourself and your job from your friendships. Let the employee know that the drug test and any actions taken will remain confidential. Drug testing results should always be confidential. If this is a worker you want to keep, you can discuss using the in lieu of termination policy, which will require an employee to participate in drug counseling and additional drug screening. You can find reasonable suspicion training on the Alpine Lumber intranet under the Safety tab in the Links section or in the training folder. Anyone driving or potentially going to drive a vehicle owned by Alpine Lumber, including the barbecue van, must have an annual motor vehicle records check to ensure they meet our insurance requirements. All CDL drivers and any non-CDL drivers crossing state lines are required to have a DOT physical. Please turn in the medical certificate to the safety department.
Truck drivers are doing their pre-trip and post-trip reports, understanding DOT rules, because that, as we are a trucking business, DOT rules definitely affect our performance. So understanding those particular things is an important part to our safety culture also.
One thing I would expect out of a system manager is load securement, making sure that our loads are properly secured, particularly big loads, frame packs, things like that.
Transportation is probably our biggest hazard and our biggest liability. We aren't doing a great job with pre- and post-trip inspections, and I know this because our Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration scores stay right around 65%. That means that 65% of the companies out there in our grouping are doing better than we are. We're in the lowest 35%. And that just means that we're not getting stuff fixed. We're not looking closely at our trucks before we take them out there. We are getting pulled over with minor fixes that should have been fixed before we left the yard. Load securement and brakes are two of our really big problems. If your drivers don't know how to check their brakes before they leave the yard, we need to get some training for them. There are driver videos on the F-Drive. I hope you leave this training thinking about how you, as a leader in our yard, can help your team improve through accountability and celebrating successes. Call Land Burying Safety if you have any questions or concerns.